The wagon hadn't even stopped rolling when one of the ranch hands cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted loud enough for everyone in the yard to hear. "Silas, your mail-order cook showed up, and she brought baggage, the breathing kind." Laughter cracked across the yard like a whip. Maeve Rowan sat straight on that buckboard with her daughter pressed against her side, 6 years old and already learning what it felt like to be the joke nobody asked for. She didn't flinch. She didn't look down. But her hand, the one Elsie couldn't see, curled into a fist against her coat until her knuckles went white. If you've ever walked into a room where everyone already decided you didn't belong, you already know exactly what she felt in that moment. If that's you, stay with me. Because what Maeve did next changed everything. Before we go further, if stories about ordinary women who refuse to stay broken speak to you, please subscribe to this channel and hit that bell so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from right now? I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Blackridge Ranch and the winter that changed everything. The freight wagon came down from the northern pass just after noon on a Tuesday, and nobody at Blackridge Ranch had been expecting it to arrive that day. The mud on the road had been bad enough to delay most supply runs by at least 2 days, and Silas Granger had already half convinced himself that the woman he'd hired sight unseen through a placement agency in Cheyenne had changed her mind and taken a better offer somewhere warmer. He almost hoped she had. He was standing at the fence line near the main barn when he heard Cutter Briggs, the loudest of his 12 permanent hands, and the one most likely to say the exact wrong thing at the exact right volume, let out that holler that bounced off every flat surface of the ranch yard. Silas turned. The wagon was real. The woman on it was real. And the small child sitting pressed against her hip, clutching a cloth bundle with both arms, was very, very real. He pulled in a long breath through his nose and let it out slow. Nobody had said anything about a child. The placement letter had been brief, the way all placement letters were. Maeve Rowan, 32, widowed, experienced camp cook, strong references from the Transcontinental Railroad camp at Bitter Creek, capable of feeding large crews under difficult conditions, seeking permanent domestic position. That was it. 2 sentences and a signature from the agency director. Silas had hired her based on those 2 sentences because his last cook had quit in October. Winter was coming in hard and fast, and he needed someone who could actually feed 16 cowboys 3 times a day without burning the biscuits or watering down the coffee. He had not hired a mother. He watched the wagon driver haul back on the reins, and the whole rig groaned to a stop in the middle of his yard. And he watched Maeve Rowan climb down from that buckboard with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been getting on and off wagons in all kinds of weather for years. She reached back up for the child without hesitating. She set Elsie on the ground. She straightened her coat. She picked up the single-worn valise at her feet, and then she looked directly at Silas Granger across 30 feet of mud and frozen ruts, and she did not smile, and she did not apologize, and she did not look away. That was the first thing he noticed about her, not her plain brown coat or the dark circles under her eyes, or the way her boots were worn thin at the heel. He noticed that she didn't flinch. The second thing he noticed was Cutter Briggs and 3 other hands circling in from the barn like dogs that had scented something interesting, and the way their mouths were already pulling into grins that had nothing respectful in them at all. "Well, hell," Cutter said to nobody in particular, but loud enough for everybody. "I've seen prettier fence posts." The men laughed. Maeve didn't react, not with her face. But Silas saw her daughter look up at the sound of that laughter, and he saw the way the little girl's fingers tightened around her mother's coat sleeve, and something shifted in his chest, something uncomfortable, like a stone turning over. He crossed the yard. "You're the woman from the agency," he said. Not a question. "Maeve Rowan," she said. "This is my daughter, Elsie." The little girl looked up at him with large gray eyes that had seen more road than a 6-year-old should have. She didn't hide behind her mother's coat. She just watched him the way children watch adults when they've learned not to expect much. Silas kept his voice even. "The letter didn't mention a child." "No," Maeve said. "It didn't." "That's a problem." "I understand if it is." Her voice was steady, not defiant, not pleading, just steady, the way a woman speaks when she has already rehearsed every version of a hard conversation and decided which one she can live with. I won't ask you to take us both on faith. Let me cook one meal, tonight's supper. You judge me by that and nothing else. If you're not satisfied, I'll go back on the next wagon north and I won't argue about it. Cutter Briggs had drifted close enough to hear. Boss, you can't be serious. She's got a kid. Where's the kid supposed to go while she's working? She gonna park her in the flour barrel? More laughter. Silas looked at Cutter with the particular kind of flat expression he used when he was deciding whether to fire someone. Cutter stopped laughing, though the grin stayed. Go check the water situation in the east pasture, Silas said. Boss, East pasture, Cutter. The grin faded. Cutter went. Silas looked back at Maeve Rowan. She was watching him with those steady eyes, the kind of eyes that had already done their crying somewhere private and weren't planning to do it again in front of strangers. He felt the stone turn over in his chest again. One supper, he said. Kitchen's in the back of the main house. Housekeeper who just quit left it in a state. I won't apologize for what you find in there. I don't need an apology, Maeve said. I need a fire lit in the stove and to know where you keep the salt. She picked up her valise, took her daughter's hand, and walked toward the main house like she'd been doing it for years. Silas stood in the cold yard and watched her go, and told himself he was only letting her cook supper because it was the practical thing to do. The kitchen was worse than Maeve had expected, and she had expected bad. The cast iron stove had a cracked firebox plate that someone had patched with river clay and forgotten about. The wood bin was down to scraps. The shelves were coated in a layer of grease and dust that told her the last cook had stopped caring sometime before she stopped showing up. Half the tin cups were missing their handles. There was a sack of cornmeal with a mouse hole chewed through the bottom, and whatever had lived in the wall behind the water barrel had been dead long enough to stop smelling like anything specific and start smelling like everything terrible. Elsie stood in the doorway and looked around with her big gray eyes. Mama, she said quietly, this is bad. Yes, it is, Maeve said. She set down her valise and rolled up her sleeves. Hand me that broom. The thing about hard kitchens was that Maeve had worked in harder ones. She'd cooked in a canvas tent during a 3-day rainstorm at Bitter Creek with nothing but a field stove and whatever she could stretch into a meal for 47 men who hadn't eaten properly in 2 days. She'd cooked in dust storms and mud floods, and once during a cattle stampede that had taken out half the supply wagon. A dirty room with a cracked stove was not going to break her. She got the fire going first. It took 3 tries because the flue was partially blocked, and the first attempt sent a billow of smoke back into the kitchen that made Elsie cough and made Maeve curse quietly under her breath in a way she hoped her daughter didn't hear. She climbed up, cleared the blockage with a long-handled brush she found hanging behind the back door, and tried again. The fire caught. Small victory. She took it. She sent Elsie to the woodpile for more fuel. Small armloads, nothing the child couldn't manage, and started working through the shelves to see what was actually usable. Flour, decent. Lard, enough. Salt, thank heaven. Dried beans that needed soaking. Potatoes that had seen better days but would work. Half a wheel of hard cheese, a string of dried onions hanging from a nail, and enough coffee beans to fuel a small army if she ground them right. No fresh meat. She'd need to ask about that. She found the ranch foreman, a quiet man named Del Hatch, who seemed to operate at a permanent low simmer of exhaustion, and asked him about beef. Del looked at her like she'd asked him to explain philosophy. You want me to butcher something? Tonight? I want whatever's already been set aside for the week, Maeve said. Your boss didn't get to be a cattle rancher without having a slaughter schedule. I just need to know where they're keeping this week's meat. Del blinked. Then he pointed toward the small outbuilding behind the barn. She found a good-sized cut of chuck that would braise down into something worth eating, and 2 soup bones that would make the whole pot sing. She carried them back to the kitchen herself, Elsie trotting alongside her, and got to work. By 5 o'clock, the kitchen smelled like a place where people actually wanted to be. By 6, 3 ranch hands she hadn't met yet found reasons to drift past the back door and look in. By 6:30, Silas Granger himself was standing in the doorway of his own kitchen with his hat in his hand, looking at the long table set with actual plates. She'd found them in a crate under the stairs, dusty but whole, and the pot of beef stew thick enough to stand a spoon in, and the fresh biscuits in the pan, and the coffee just coming up to the right temperature, and he didn't say anything for a long moment. How many men do you usually sit for supper? Maeve asked without looking up from ladling. 12 when they're all here, Silas said. Some nights 8. I made enough for 14, she said. Wasn't sure what your appetite runs. Cutter Briggs appeared at Silas's shoulder, apparently incapable of staying away from anything he'd already decided to mock. He looked at the table. He looked at the stew. He looked at the biscuits. Something in his expression shifted. Not all the way to respect, not yet, but the scorn was wavering. That smells all right, he admitted, like the words cost him something. Sit down, Maeve said, before it cools. Supper that night was the quietest meal the Blackridge bunkhouse crew had eaten in months. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the food was too good to talk over. Men who had been shoveling cold beans and stiff cornbread for 2 months sat over Maeve Rowan's beef stew and biscuits and went very, very still in the particular way that men go still when something has reminded them of home. Silas ate at the head of the table and didn't say a word. Afterward, when the hands had filtered back out into the cold, and Elsie had fallen asleep in the corner chair with her head against her cloth bundle, Maeve began washing the dishes in the basin, because the dishes didn't wash themselves and nobody had offered to help. Silas came back into the kitchen. He stood there for a moment, turning his hat in his hands in a slow circle the way men do when they've got something to say and haven't figured out how to say it yet. "You can stay," he said. Maeve didn't stop washing dishes. "I know," she said. He stood there another beat, not quite sure how to respond to that. "The child can have the small room at the end of the hall," he said, "the one near the kitchen, so she's close." Maeve set down the dish she was holding and turned to look at him then. Just for a moment. Something passed across her face. Not gratitude exactly, something more complicated and more honest than gratitude. Relief, maybe, but the kind that's been held back for so long it hurts a little on the way out. "Thank you," she said. It was 2 words. She said them like they were the only 2 words in the English language that actually meant anything. Silas nodded, still turning his hat, and walked back out. Maeve turned back to the dishes and the steam rising from the basin, and for exactly 30 seconds she let herself breathe. Really breathe. The kind of breathing you do when you've been holding something in your lungs for months without knowing it. Her shoulders dropped. Her eyes closed. Then she opened them. There was still the floor to sweep, the stove to bank, the morning's breakfast to plan. She picked up the next dish. In the corner, Elsie slept on, exhausted and warm for the first time in a very long time. Outside, the first real cold of winter was moving down from the mountains like it intended to stay. Neither Maeve nor Silas knew yet just how much colder it was going to get, or what that cold was about to demand of her, and of him. But the kitchen fire was burning, the dishes were getting clean, and somewhere in the bare bones of Blackridge Ranch, the faintest first warmth of something that might one day be called home had just very quietly begun. The first week at Blackridge Ranch did not go the way anyone expected, including Maeve. She had assumed, after that first supper, that the worst of it was behind her. She had cooked, they had eaten, Silas had said she could stay. In her experience, proving yourself once was usually enough to buy a little peace. But Blackridge was not a railroad camp where men rotated in and out every few months and forgot your name by spring. These men lived here. They worked here. They had opinions that had been sitting undisturbed for years, growing roots, and one good pot of beef stew was not going to pull those roots up overnight. Cutter Briggs made sure of that. He wasn't cruel the way some men were cruel, with fists or volume or the kind of meanness that announces itself. He was the other kind, the kind that works in small cuts. A comment dropped at the breakfast table about how the coffee was a little thin. A question asked in front of the other hands about whether Maeve had any experience cooking for a real outfit or just camp trash. A story told in the bunkhouse, loud enough to carry through the thin walls into the kitchen, about a cook his cousin had hired once, a widow woman who'd turned out to be more interested in the boss's bank account than his biscuits. Maeve heard every word of that story. She was washing the supper dishes at the time. She washed them very carefully and did not drop a single one. Del Hatch, the foreman, knocked on the kitchen doorframe that same evening. He was a man of maybe 55, built like someone had stacked years of hard work on top of each other and let them compress. And he had a face that gave very little away. But he'd been watching things with those quiet eyes of his since Maeve arrived, and something in the way he knocked, twice, soft, like he was trying not to startle anything fragile, told her he hadn't come to cause trouble. "Don't let Cutter get under your skin," he said. "He's not under my skin," Maeve said. Dell looked at the way she was scrubbing that pot and didn't say anything. He's not, she said again, slightly less convincingly. He does it to everybody new, Dell said. He did it to me and I'd been working cattle since before he was born. He'll stop when he gets bored or when something else gets his attention. How long does that usually take? Dell thought about it with the genuine consideration of a man who had timed this sort of thing before. Couple weeks, maybe 3. Maeve set the pot down and dried her hands on her apron. 3 weeks is a long time. It is, Dell agreed. He didn't offer anything else. He was the kind of man who stated facts and let you work out what to do with them yourself. Maeve found she appreciated that more than she'd expected. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and went back out into the cold. 3 weeks turned out to be optimistic. Cutter's commentary kept up through the second week and into the third. By that point, some of the younger hands had started echoing him. Not with the same sharpness, more the way young men echo whoever seems loudest and most confident, because certainty is attractive when you're 22 and don't have much of your own. Maeve noticed which ones they were. She noticed which ones they weren't too. There were 4 or 5 men in that crew who kept their heads down, ate what she put in front of them, said thank you when they were done, and looked mildly embarrassed by the whole performance. She filed that away. Meanwhile, Elsie was adapting in the particular fast and heartbreaking way that children adapt when they have no other choice. She found a corner of the kitchen that she claimed as her own, a spot between the far end of the work table and the wall where she could sit with her back to solid wood and see everything without being in the way of anything. She'd set her cloth bundle there every morning like she was staking a flag. She brought things to fill the space, a smooth river rock she'd found near the water barrel, a piece of red wool she'd unraveled from a torn sock, a stub of chalk someone had dropped in the yard. Small things. Anchors. She didn't talk much in those first weeks. She watched. The man she watched most was Silas Granger. Silas was not an easy man to watch, because he was not a man who made himself easy to see. He came to meals, he gave instructions, he made decisions about cattle and fencing and supply orders with the brisk competence of someone who had been running this place for long enough that it ran partly on reflex. He was not unkind to Elsie. He was also not warm. He looked at her sometimes with an expression that Maeve couldn't quite name. Not discomfort exactly, something more like distance, like he was looking at her through glass and couldn't figure out how to reach through it. Maeve knew a thing or two about grief that hadn't been processed properly. She recognized its furniture, the way it arranged itself in a person's face when they thought nobody was watching. She didn't press it. She had enough of her own to manage. What she focused on, what she poured herself into with the single-minded intensity of a woman who knew that purpose was the only thing standing between her and the particular despair of starting over with nothing, was the work. The actual, physical, daily, relentless work of feeding a cattle ranch. It was more than cooking. People who've never done it don't understand that. There's the cooking, yes, 3 meals a day, every day, no holidays on a working ranch, and the meals had to be hot, and they had to be enough, and they had to be ready exactly when the men came in from work, because cold, hungry men are short-tempered men, and short-tempered men do stupid things around livestock and equipment. But underneath the cooking was the planning. What supplies were running low? What needed to be ordered before the next town run? What could be stretched and what couldn't? What the weather was going to do to the crew's calorie needs. Cold men burn more, and a ranch in November with temperatures dropping every night needed a different kitchen than a ranch in August. Maeve had learned all of this the hard way at Bitter Creek, feeding railroad workers in conditions that made Blackridge look comfortable. She didn't think of that experience as something to be proud of. She thought of it as the education she'd paid for in the worst possible coin, and she intended to use every penny of it. She reorganized the pantry in the second week. Not dramatically, she wasn't trying to make a statement, but systematically, moving things so the most used items were where she could reach them fast, and the things that needed to be rationed were where she could see how much was left at a glance. She fixed the stovepipe seal herself with proper fire clay she'd found in the tool shed, which stopped the smoke draft problem and dropped the kitchen from uncomfortable to merely warm. She found that the root cellar beneath the back step had been underused. There was good, cool storage down there for things that were currently sitting in the kitchen getting old too fast, and she moved them down and freed up shelf space. Small changes, practical things, nothing that announced itself. But Dell noticed. Dell noticed everything. You rearranged the cellar, he said one morning, not accusatory, just observational. Potatoes last longer down there, Maeve said, and it frees up the shelf near the window for things that need to be dry. Dell nodded slowly, like a man confirming a calculation he'd already run in his head. Previous cook used to forget to check on things down there. We lost half a supply of turnips last February. I won't forget, Maeve said. Dell nodded again and went to get his coffee. That was as far as Dell Hatch went, a fairly rousing endorsement. By the end of the third week, a couple of the quieter hands, a rangy young man named Tobias, who couldn't have been more than 20, and an older hand called Preach, who had a beard like a February storm, and apparently gotten his nickname from some distant past that nobody discussed, had started coming to the kitchen a few minutes early before each meal. Not in the way that men come when they want something, in the way they come when they feel comfortable somewhere. They'd lean against the counter or sit on the wood bin and sometimes talk and sometimes not talk, and Maeve would work around them without making it a thing, and Elsie would sit in her corner and watch them with her serious gray eyes. And gradually something that felt a little bit like a room that people actually wanted to be in started to happen in that kitchen. Cutter noticed. He didn't like it. He escalated. It happened on a Wednesday, mid-morning, between the breakfast cleanup and the noon meal preparation. Maeve was working through a batch of bread dough, the sourdough starter she'd found at the back of the pantry, half dead but salvageable. She'd been coaxing it back to life for 2 weeks. When Cutter came into the kitchen without knocking, he looked around like he was conducting an inspection. His eyes moved across the reorganized shelves, the clean surfaces, the orderly row of pots hanging from their proper hooks, and his mouth pulled into the particular tight expression of a man who has decided in advance that he dislikes what he's seen. "Where's the whiskey?" he said. Maeve kept working the dough. "What whiskey?" "There was a bottle in the cabinet by the flour. Last cook kept it there. Cooking whiskey." "I used the cabinet by the flour for the extra cornmeal," Maeve said. "There was no whiskey in it when I moved things." "The hell there wasn't." She stopped kneading. She turned and looked at him directly, which was something she'd noticed he didn't enjoy. People who looked at him head-on instead of sideways. "I didn't move a whiskey bottle, Cutter. If there was one, it was gone before I got here." "You calling me a liar?" "I'm telling you what I found when I reorganized those shelves," she said. Her voice was even. Not quiet, even. There's a difference. Quiet can get ignored, even makes you pay attention. If you want to take that as calling you a liar, that's your business. He took a step toward the work table. He was a big man, Cutter, not in a way that was threatening exactly, but in a way that was designed to remind you that he was bigger than you. "You've been rearranging things in this kitchen like you own the place," he said, "like it belongs to you." "Mr. Granger hired me to run this kitchen," Maeve said. "Running it means I need to know where everything is and why." "Mr. Granger?" He repeated it with a little curl in his voice. "You on first-name basis with Mr. Granger yet?" And there it was. That was what this was actually about. She'd suspected it since the second week, and now she knew it for certain. The whiskey was not about whiskey. "I call him Mr. Granger because that's his name, and he's my employer," Maeve said. "Same as you do." "Same as I—" He stopped. His jaw worked for a second. "I've been at this ranch 6 years. I was here when his wife died. I was here when he almost lost the North Pasture in that drought 2 summers ago. I've bled for this place." "I know you have," Maeve said, and she meant it, not as a concession, but as a fact. She could see it in the way he talked about the ranch, even through the bluster. Men like Cutter weren't angry at strangers for nothing. They were angry at strangers for what the strangers represented, which was change, and what change represented, which was the possibility that what you'd built could be rearranged by someone who didn't know what it cost. That's not nothing. He hadn't expected that. She watched him recalibrate, the anger looking for its footing. "Then stay in your lane," he said, but it had less heat now. "My lane is this kitchen," Maeve said. She turned back to her dough. "Which means you're standing in it. So if you're not here to eat, I need you to step out so I can get the noon meal started." She heard him stand there for another several seconds. Then she heard him go. She pressed both hands into the dough and let out a breath through her nose and stared at the wall for exactly as long as it took to get her heartbeat back to where it belonged. Then she started working the dough again. From her corner, Elsie's voice came small and careful. "Mama, is that man going to make us leave?" "No," Maeve said. "How do you know?" Because I haven't done anything wrong. She paused. That's not always enough, but it's a start. Elsie considered this with the weighted seriousness she applied to most things. I don't like him, she said. You don't have to like him, Maeve said. You just have to be polite. That seems unfair. It is, Maeve agreed. A lot of things are. Elsie accepted this, apparently satisfied, and went back to whatever she'd been arranging between her river rock and her red wool. It was 2 days after this, Friday, mid-afternoon, when the light was getting thin and the temperature had been dropping steadily since noon, that Silas came into the kitchen for the first time since that initial evening, not passing through, not looking for something, actually came in and stood at the far end of the work table and looked like a man who had come to say something he wasn't sure how to say. Maeve was peeling potatoes. She kept peeling. Cutter came to me, Silas said. I figured, Maeve said. He said you'd move things around without asking. I reorganized the kitchen storage so I can do my job more efficiently, Maeve said. If that needed asking, I didn't know it. I can ask next time. Silas was quiet for a moment. He also said there was an issue about a bottle. There was no bottle, Maeve said. Or if there was, it wasn't there when I reorganized. I told him that. I believe you, Silas said. She looked up. He said it flatly, without apparent effort, like it was simply the obvious conclusion and not worth spending extra words on. She found, to her slight annoyance, that she was moved by how small a thing it was and how much it mattered. Cutter's been here a long time, Silas said. He doesn't do well with changes. He's made that clear, Maeve said. I'm not asking you to accommodate him. Good. I'm asking you to not accelerate things. Maeve set down the potato and the knife and looked at him. I told him to leave my kitchen when he came in picking a fight over nothing. I'm going to keep doing that. That's not acceleration. That's maintenance. Something crossed Silas Granger's face that might, under better lighting and from a slightly different angle, have been the beginning of a smile. It didn't fully arrive. But it had been in the neighborhood. Fair enough, he said. He started to go. Then he stopped. The bread you made yesterday, he said, without turning around. What about it? My wife used to make bread like that. He said it the way you might state a fact about the weather. Flat, careful, like something you'd practiced keeping the weight out of. Sourdough, same smell. Maeve didn't say anything. She understood with a precision born from personal experience that there was nothing to say that would help, and a great many things that could make it worse. That's all, Silas said, and went. She stood in her kitchen for a long moment after his footsteps faded down the hallway, the half-peeled potato in her hand, and she thought about grief, and about the way it shows up in your own kitchen wearing somebody else's face, and about how neither of them had asked to be standing on either side of this particular situation. Then she picked up the knife and finished the potatoes. The cold came harder that week. Not the winter cold. That was still building itself up in the mountains, gathering. This was the cold that announces that real cold is coming, the kind that gets into the morning air and stays there even when the sun is up, that turns the mud in the yard to iron by 6 a.m. and cracks the knuckles of men who aren't wearing good gloves. Silas had the crew out working through it, checking fence lines and moving cattle to better shelter. The kind of autumn preparation that on a cattle ranch is done with a particular grimness, because everyone knows that the work you fail to do now becomes a catastrophe you deal with in February. Maeve felt the shift in the men when they came in for meals. Shorter tempers, stiffer backs, fewer words. She adjusted without it being told. Bigger portions, the coffee stronger, the dessert. When she had the ingredients for one, appearing more frequently because sometimes what a man needed at the end of a brutal day wasn't food exactly, but the proof that someone had thought about what he needed and done something about it before he had to ask. Even Cutter stopped throwing commentary at her with quite the same enthusiasm. He ate. He was still Cutter, but he ate. The quiet was almost pleasant, which was, of course, exactly when everything fell apart. It was Dell who brought her the news, and the look on his face when he came through the kitchen door at 7 in the evening told her before he said a word that this was not a small problem. Storm coming, he said. Bad one. Weather's turned up north and it's moving fast. Silas just got word from the Hendersons on the ridge. They clocked it at 40 below wind chill up there this afternoon. Maeve set down the dish she was drying. When does it hit? 2 days? Maybe less? Could be tomorrow night if it moves the way Silas thinks it will. Dell's voice was controlled the way only very experienced men in very serious situations manage to keep their voices controlled. Here's the problem. We've got 16 men out on the fall drive. Silas sent 3 riders out this afternoon to push them home fast as they can, but with 1,000 head of cattle, they won't make the homeward run before the storm, Maeve said. No, they'll come in during it or right after, and they'll be frozen through and they'll need food, Maeve said. A lot of it. Hot. The trail cook, Dell said, and here his voice did something. A brief tightening, like a rope pulled too far. Jacobs. We got a wire from him this afternoon. He's sick. Can't make the return drive. He's sitting it out at the Clearwater station. The silence in this kitchen lasted exactly 3 seconds. How many riders total when the drive crew comes in? Maeve asked. 16 on the drive, 12 here. That's 28 men, Maeve said, plus you and Silas, 30. Dell looked at her. He looked at her the way people look at something they've underestimated and are recalibrating in real time. Silas he's considering sending to town for someone. There's no time to get anyone from town, Maeve said. She was already moving, pulling the pantry door open, running her eyes across the shelves with the focused inventory-taking speed of someone who's done this under worse circumstances. How much warning do I have? 36 hours? Maybe 40? 36 hours. She counted it out in her head. What she had. What she needed. What was possible. Go tell Silas I need to speak with him, she said. Now, Dell, please. Dell went. She was still standing in front of the open pantry, running calculations, when Silas came in 3 minutes later. He had his coat on and his hat in his hand and the look of a man who had been dealing with 3 problems at once and was braced for a 4th. He looked at her. She looked at him. Can you do it? He said. Not a long speech, not an apology for the position she was in, just that. It was, she would think later, exactly the right question to ask. She thought about 30 hungry, frozen men coming in from a cattle drive in a blizzard. She thought about the state of her pantry, which was better than it had been when she arrived, and still not where she'd want it for something like this. She thought about the cracked firebox plate she'd repaired and the sourdough starter she'd brought back from the dead. And the way she'd been reorganizing this kitchen for 3 weeks precisely so she could move fast when she needed to. She thought about Bitter Creek and the 47 men and the storm that had lasted 4 days. How many riders? She asked. 30 when everyone's in, Silas said. She closed the pantry door. I'll need everything in the root cellar brought up tonight, she said. I need someone to get me 3 more sacks of flour from the supply barn and all the dried beans. I need whoever's least useful tomorrow assigned to keeping my wood bin full because I can't be stopping to haul wood. I need the second stove in the bunkhouse kitchen lit and kept burning starting at midnight because I'm going to need the extra cooking surface. And I need, she paused, checking her mental list. I need someone to check the spare coffee supply because what I have in here won't cover 30 men through a blizzard. Silas was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. That's a lot of needs, he said. You asked if I could do it, she said. That's what doing it requires. He held her gaze for another beat. Then he turned and went to the door and stuck his head out and started issuing orders to whoever was within earshot, his voice taking on that particular carrying authority of a man accustomed to being listened to in weather. Maeve turned back to her kitchen. She looked at the stove. She looked at the shelves. She looked at the work table she'd been using for 3 weeks and knew now like she knew her own hands. 30 men. 1 blizzard. 1 kitchen. She rolled up her sleeves. Elsie had appeared in her corner, watching with those gray eyes, having woken from an early sleep to the sound of activity and urgency moving through the house. Mama, she said, what's happening? There's a storm coming, Maeve said. She was already moving, pulling the big pot down from its hook. And a lot of men who are going to need feeding when it gets here. Are we going to be okay? Maeve set the pot on the stove, turned to look at her daughter, and gave her the same answer she always tried to give her. Not the comfortable answer, not the easy one, but the true one. We're going to work, she said. That's the same as okay, most of the time. Outside, the wind had started to pick up from the north. Just a little. Just enough that you could hear it around the corners of the house, feeling its way along the walls, testing the seams. Maeve built the fire up higher and started to work. The wind came in from the north just after 10 o'clock that night, and it did not come quietly. It hit the house like something with a grudge, rattling the kitchen window in its frame and pushing cold air through the gap beneath the back door in a thin, continuous stream that Maeve stuffed with a rolled flour sack and then ignored because she couldn't afford to spend time on what she couldn't fix. The temperature had been dropping since sundown. By the time the ranch yard went dark and the last of the permanent hands had retreated to the bunkhouse, the thermometer nailed to the porch post read 18 degrees and was moving in the wrong direction. Maeve had been working since 7. She'd started with inventory, a full, methodical count of everything in the pantry, the root cellar, and the supply crates Dell had brought in from the barn before the cold got too serious. Flour, good. Lard, enough if she was careful. Dried beans, 2 full sacks plus half of a third. Coffee, she'd sent Tobias to check the reserve supply in the tack room where previous cooks had apparently stashed overflow, and he'd come back with 2 large tins that would help. Potatoes, onions, dried apples, a crock of salt pork, a good amount of dried corn, 3 sides of smoked bacon hanging in the cold storage shed that she could work with. The fresh beef was the variable, so there was enough for 1 large pot, maybe 2 if she stretched it right, which meant the stew she was planning had to count. She worked out the math in her head the way she'd learned to do it at Bitter Creek, where the supply wagon was always late and the crew was always hungry, and you figured out how to make what you had feed more people than it was supposed to feed, and you did it without making it obvious that you were stretching because hungry men who knew they were getting short portions got mean in ways that made your job harder. 30 men. Coming in frozen, some of them probably half sick from exposure, all of them with the particular hollow-eyed exhaustion of a cattle drive pushed hard through deteriorating weather. They would need heat first, coffee, something hot to hold, and then substance, real food, not something thin and apologetic. She mapped it out. A beef and bean stew in the largest pot she had, started now so it could cook low and long through the night and develop the depth of flavor that couldn't be hurried. Fresh biscuits in batches because biscuits didn't hold well, and these men deserved hot ones. The sourdough she'd nursed back to life over 3 weeks had been fed that afternoon in anticipation. It was active and ready, and she could do a second bread alongside the biscuits for the men who wanted something to hold in their hands while they waited. Apple cobbler from the dried apples, because after a cattle drive in a blizzard, a man needed something sweet, something that reminded him the world wasn't entirely made of ice and hard work. And coffee. Coffee in quantities that would have seemed excessive anywhere else and were, here, barely sufficient. The bunkhouse stove had been lit at midnight, as she'd asked. She'd put Tobias in charge of keeping it fed because he was young and willing and understood that this was serious without needing it explained twice. That gave her 2 additional cooking surfaces she could use for the overflow. The second bean pot, the cobbler pans, the extra coffee kettle. What it didn't give her was more hands, or more hours. By midnight, she had the stew going and the sourdough shaped and proofing in the warmth near the stove, and she started on the first prep work for the biscuits, measuring, cutting the lard in, keeping everything ready to go so she could move fast when the time came. Her hands were doing the work her brain had mapped out, and her body was running on the particular focused energy that kicks in when the task is large enough that there's no room left over for anything else. Not fear, not exhaustion, not the thought of what happened if she fell short, just the work. Just the next thing, and the next, and the next. Around 1 in the morning, Dell appeared in the kitchen doorway. I was wearing his full winter gear still, which meant he hadn't been to sleep. Storm's moving faster than Silas figured, he said. The riders he sent out to push the drive crew. One of them came back. Road north of the ridgeline cutoff is already drifting. Visibility is going to be bad by morning. Maeve looked up from the biscuit dough she was cutting. The drive crew. Are they going to make it in? Silas thinks they'll push through the night rather than try to hold the cattle in a storm without shelter. That means they'll be coming in sometime before dawn, maybe right at it, cold and dark, and then breakfast has to be ready before sunup, Maeve said. Not at sunup, before. Dell was quiet for a moment. That's 3, maybe 4 hours from now. I know what time it is, Dell. He stood there for a second longer, and she saw him doing the calculation. The size of the task, the time available, the number of people currently working in this kitchen, which was 1, and she saw him reach the conclusion that anyone with any sense would reach and dismiss it because there was no other conclusion available. Is there anything I can do? He said. It was the right question, and she felt it land properly. Del Hatch was a cattle foreman. He did not cook. He did not particularly want to be in a kitchen. He was asking because the situation called for it, and he was too practical a man to let pride be an obstacle. "Can you peel potatoes?" she asked. "I've peeled a potato," he said, in a tone that suggested this was not his preferred activity, but that he was willing. "Pull up a stool," Maeve said. "I'll show you where the knife is." So Del Hatch, who had been foreman of Blackridge Ranch for 11 years and had driven cattle in 6 different territories, and once personally roped a bull that had gone through a fence and onto a neighboring property in the dark, sat on a stool in Maeve's kitchen at 1 in the morning and peeled potatoes. He did it slowly and with great concentration, and he took off more of the potato than was strictly necessary, but he filled the bowl she needed filled. And when he was done, he looked at her for the next instruction without complaint. She put him to work slicing bacon. At 2 in the morning, Silas came in. He came in the way he always came into the kitchen, stopping at the doorway first, checking the room before entering, which was a habit Maeve had noticed early and filed away as someone who had learned to be careful about taking up space in rooms he wasn't sure he belonged in. He looked at Del with mild surprise. He looked at the 2 active stoves, the rising bread, the large stew pot, the organized rows of prepped ingredients waiting their turns, and the general organized chaos of a kitchen running at full capacity, and he didn't say anything for a moment. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "I'm fine," Maeve said. She said it the same way she'd told Del she knew what time it was. Not dismissive, just precise. She didn't have space right now for fine to mean anything complicated. Silas looked at the stew pot. "Can I—" "Don't lift the lid," she said. He stopped, hand halfway extended. "It's building pressure and flavor, and every time someone lifts the lid in the first 3 hours, it loses 10 minutes of work," she said. "It'll be fine. You don't need to check it." He pulled his hand back. He actually looked slightly sheepish, which was not an expression she had previously associated with Silas Granger. "I wasn't doubting you," he said. "I know," she said. "But men always lift the lid." Del made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Silas glanced at him. Del went back to his bacon. "What do you need from me?" Silas asked. "Right now? Make sure someone keeps the wood bin full through the night. The fire in the bunkhouse stove needs to be consistent, not hot, steady. And when your drive crew comes in, I need 10 minutes warning if you can manage it. 10 minutes is the difference between biscuits that are hot and biscuits that are almost hot." 10 minutes, Silas said. "That's all." He looked at her for a moment with that same unreadable expression. Not the glass-pane distance he sometimes turned on Elsie. Something different. Something more like the way a person looks when they're updating an assessment they'd already made and finding it needs to move significantly in one direction. "I'll make sure of the warning," he said. He went. But he came back 20 minutes later with an armload of wood for the bin, which he didn't have to do, and which he did without being asked, and without saying anything about it. He stacked it neatly. He was a neat man, Silas, orderly in the small physical ways that people with organized minds tend to be. And he went back out again. Maeve watched the door close behind him and felt something she didn't have time to examine settle somewhere in her chest and stay there. The storm hit fully at 3:30 in the morning. The wind went from strong to something meaner, the kind of wind that had mass and intent, and the snow it carried was the dry, fine kind that found every gap and sifted in under doors and around window frames and made a thin white line along the inside of the sill. The temperature outside had dropped to what Del, checking the porch thermometer on a fast trip to the outhouse, reported as somewhere between brutal and unsurvivable for any livestock not in shelter. The cattle. The drive crew. Maeve heard the tension in the house tighten like a rope being winched. She heard Silas moving through the front rooms, checking, his boots hitting the floor in quick, even strides. She heard voices outside, muffled, urgent, the particular pitch of men dealing with a problem that was larger than anticipated. She kept cooking. The bread came out of the oven at 4 a.m., and the smell of it went through the house the way a warm hand reaches through cold. Immediate, specific, undeniable. She set the loaves to cool for the minimum time she could allow and started the first batch of biscuits. At 4:20, Del appeared in the doorway. "They're coming in," he said. Silas spotted lanterns from the North Ridge. 20 minutes, maybe less. Her 10 minutes of warning doubled. She'd take it. "Tell Silas to get men into the bunkhouse mess to set the tables," she said. "Every plate we have. Get the benches in from the side room. I need seating for 30, and I need it done before they come through the door because cold men don't stand around waiting patiently. Dell was already turning. Dell, he stopped. Tell them to bring extra lanterns into the mess. I want it bright in there, light and warm. Make it feel like somewhere they want to be, not just somewhere they have to be. Dell gave her a look, not dismissive, the opposite, like she'd said something that surprised him with its accuracy. He nodded and went. She pulled the first biscuit batch from the oven, started the second, checked the stew, which was ready, which was exactly right, which smelled the way she'd hoped it would smell when she started it 6 hours ago, and began ladling portions into the large serving pots that could be carried through to the bunkhouse mess. She heard them before she saw them. The sound of horses coming into a yard in bad weather is not a sound easily confused with anything else. It's tired horses, moving through resistance, guided by men who are just as tired, and it has a heaviness to it that comes through walls. She heard it and kept moving because everything was on its timing now, and stopping was not an option. Through the kitchen window, in the half-dark before dawn, she could see lanterns moving in the yard. Then the bunkhouse door opened and let out a rectangle of light and warmth, and the first men started coming in. Tobias appeared at the kitchen door, wide-eyed. "They're here, Mrs. Rowan. There's a lot of them. They look—" "Take this pot," Maeve said. She pushed the first large serving pot of stew toward him. "Carry it with both hands, set it on the center table, keep the ladle with it, come straight back for the next one." He took the pot and went. She worked the biscuit oven, pulling and loading with the steady rhythm of someone who has done this enough that it doesn't require thought, just attention, and all her attention was here. The cobbler was in this bunkhouse oven. She'd sent it over an hour ago to slow finish in the lower heat, and the coffee was going on both sides, enough to fill every cup in the place twice over. Tobias came back. She sent him with the bread. He came back again. She sent him with the second bean pot. On his third return, she handed him the full coffee kettle and told him not to spill it, and he took it with both hands and the expression of a young man carrying something extremely important, which was accurate. She checked the biscuit count. She had enough for 32 men to have 2 each, which was what she'd aimed for, and she loaded them into the wide, flat pans and carried them herself, because she needed to see the room. The bunkhouse mess hall was loud in the way that rooms full of cold, exhausted, relieved men are loud. Not cheerful exactly, not yet, but the particular rising noise of people who have been silent and tense for too long, and are now in a warm place with a roof over their heads and something hot in front of them. She saw frost still on several men's jacket collars. She saw hands wrapped around coffee cups with the stiff, careful grip of fingers that weren't entirely working yet. She saw faces that had been out in that wind for hours, chapped raw, tight with exhaustion. Some of them blanked out with the kind of fatigue that goes past tired into somewhere else. She set the biscuit pans down on the end tables and nobody looked up at her, and she didn't need them to. Then the smell of the biscuits reached the room. It is a specific thing, the smell of fresh biscuits in a cold place. It is almost unfair in how directly it bypasses whatever a person is thinking about and goes straight to something older and more fundamental. Men who had been staring at the table or at their cups or at nothing particular looked up. Heads turned. The room got quieter. Not fully quiet, but quieter. Men started reaching for the biscuit pans. She watched the first man, Shet, a trail-hardened rider near the far end of the table, maybe 45, with the kind of face that suggested he didn't soften easily, pick up a biscuit and bite into it. He stopped chewing for a fraction of a second. Something changed in his expression. He looked at the biscuit. He looked around the room as if confirming that other people were eating the same thing. He went back to eating. The cobbler came out. Tobias and one of the permanent hands carried it through in the big cast-iron pan and set it down, and the smell of cooked apple and brown sugar hit the room like a second wave, and the noise level in the mess went up again, this time with something more specific in it. Someone said, "Where did this come from?" Tobias pointed back toward the main house kitchen. Maeve had gone back for the last coffee kettle and was coming through the bunkhouse door at that moment, and she heard the room shift again. A different quality of attention, the kind that comes when people who were absorbed in their own needs suddenly register that there's someone standing in the room who is responsible for all of it. She set the coffee kettle on the sideboard and picked up the ladle. It was an old man who spoke first. She'd noticed him when she came in, sitting at the near end of the first table, probably 65 if not more, The kind of lean and weather-worn that suggested he'd been doing this work since before most of the men in this room were born. He'd been watching the room since she walked in, not eating yet, just watching, and there was something in the quality of his attention that was different from the other men, more particular. Like he was looking for something specific. He found it, apparently, because he set his coffee cup down and he said, in a voice that carried without being raised, "What's your name, cook?" The room was not silent, but several men near him went quiet. "Maeve Rowan," she said. The old man looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were the pale, washed-out blue of someone who had spent 50 years squinting into sun and wind and weather. "Rowan," he said. "Maeve Rowan." He said it like he was checking it against something. "You ever worked the railroad camps out at Bitter Creek?" The room got a little quieter. "I did," Maeve said. 5 years. The old man nodded slowly, not in surprise, in confirmation. "There was a cook at Bitter Creek," he said, 4 winters back. Kept an entire camp of 60 men fed through the worst season anyone could remember out there. Crew came down with half of them sick in week 2, and the supply wagon didn't come for 11 days. He paused. People who were there said they would have lost men without her. The room was quiet now, genuinely quiet. 30 men, plates of food in front of them, and not one of them making a sound. "I don't know about that," Maeve said, because she genuinely didn't, or more accurately because she'd spent 4 years trying not to think about those 11 days, and wasn't going to start now. "I do," the old man said. "My nephew was in that camp. He talked about that cook for a year." He looked at her with those pale eyes. He said if he ever met her, he was going to take off his hat. He reached up and took off his hat. He set it on the table. At the far end of the room, one of the younger trail riders looked at the old man. Then he looked at his hat. Then he reached up and took his own hat off. It moved through the room not like a wave. Waves are fast and synchronized, but like something slower and more deliberate, the way individual men make individual decisions that happen to arrive at the same place. One by one, hat after hat, coming off and being set on tables, or held in laps, or placed on knees, the way men do when they want to show that they mean it. Cutter Briggs was sitting 3 men down from the old trail hand. Maeve saw him watching it happen. She saw his jaw tighten. She saw him look at the hat in his own hands. He'd taken it off when he came in from the cold, the way men do automatically, and look back at her. He didn't put it back on. He set it on the table. It was not an apology. Cutter Briggs was not a man who apologized, but it was something, and Maeve understood it the way you understand gestures from people who don't make them often, not as what it was, but as what it cost. She looked at the room. These men, all of them, trail-burned and frostbitten and past tired, sitting in the warmth and the light with her food in front of them and their hats off. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel vindicated. She felt, more than anything, the particular bone-deep tiredness of someone who has held themselves taut for a very long time, and is only now, in this specific moment, starting to feel the weight of what that cost. Her feet hurt. Her back had been aching since 2 in the morning. She had flour on her left sleeve and a burn on the back of her right hand from catching the oven rack. Wrong on the 3rd biscuit batch that she'd been ignoring for hours. She also felt something else. Something she didn't have a clean name for. Not pride exactly, more like the specific satisfaction of a thing done right under difficult conditions, which is a feeling that doesn't arrive loud and doesn't stay long, but while it's there is as solid as anything she'd ever stood on. She picked up the coffee kettle and started refilling cups, because the cups weren't going to refill themselves. Silas Granger was standing in the doorway of the bunkhouse mess. She didn't know how long he'd been there. She found him when she turned to go back to the sideboard for the second kettle, and he was standing there with his shoulder against the doorframe and his arms crossed and an expression on his face that she had never seen on him before. He was watching the room, watching the hats on the tables, watching the men eating with a quiet concentration that had replaced the frozen misery they'd carried in with them 20 minutes ago. And his face had that look, the one you see on people when they're realizing something that should have been obvious, and the realizing of it is doing something to them that they weren't expecting. Maeve met his eyes across the room. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. She went to get the second coffee kettle, but she felt his eyes follow her the way you feel heat from a fire you're not looking at directly, and she filed that away too, in the particular private place where she put things that needed thinking about later, when there was time. There wasn't time now. The mess hall needed managing. The cobbler was going fast, and she needed to assess whether there was enough for the men who hadn't gotten to it yet. And the bread needed cutting, and somewhere in the bunkhouse kitchen, the second bean pot needed stirring or it would catch on the bottom, and Tobias, bless him, had been on his feet since midnight and was starting to make the kinds of small errors that tired people make, and someone needed to watch him before he tipped something hot onto himself. She worked through it. An hour more, maybe 90 minutes, and then the mess was down to the slow eating and the coffee refilling and the particular contented quietness of a large group of men who are genuinely full for the first time in days. Outside, the blizzard was going full. The wind hit the bunkhouse walls in long, sustained pushes that rattled the shutters and made the lantern flames tighten and flatten for seconds at a time. Nobody moved to go back out. There was nowhere to go and nothing to do until the storm broke, and inside there was warmth and food and the company of other people who had made it through the same thing, and for tonight that was sufficient. Maeve finally sat down. She sat on the bench against the back wall of the bunkhouse kitchen, the room that connected to the mess through a serving window, and she just sat. Her hands in her lap, her eyes on the middle distance, the sounds of the mess coming through the serving window, low and comfortable now, the clink of cups, and the murmur of exhausted men settling into the particular horizontalness of after. She hadn't slept. She'd been on her feet for, she counted back, and stopped counting because the number was large enough to be discouraging, and she still had breakfast to think about in a few hours. Elsie. She sat up sharply. Elsie was in the main house, in her room at the end of the hall, and had been asleep when Maeve last checked at midnight and should be fine. She'd told Dell to check on her if he went back through the house. But the fact that she hadn't thought about Elsie in 4 hours sat on her like something physical. She was halfway to the door when Silas appeared in it. "Your daughter's fine," he said immediately. "She woke up about an hour ago and couldn't sleep, and she's in the main kitchen. I found her there." A brief pause. "She's been talking to me." Maeve stopped. "Talking to you?" "Yes." He said it in a way that suggested he was still processing this. "About several things. She has opinions about the weather, and about horses. And at some point she asked me if I was sad." Maeve felt something move through her that was half a laugh and half something more complicated. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be." He said it quickly, quietly. She's a particular child." "She is," Maeve agreed. "She asked me about my wife." He said it the same careful, flat way he'd said it in the kitchen about the bread, like a fact about weather. "I don't know how she knew to ask. I didn't tell her anything. She just asked." "What did you say?" "I said she'd been gone 3 years. He was quiet for a moment. "Elsie said that was a long time to be sad by yourself." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that happens when something true has been said out loud by someone too young to know they shouldn't, and the adults in the vicinity are working out what to do with it. "She's not wrong," Maeve said. No, Silas said. "She isn't." He looked at her. The lantern light in the doorway was behind him, and she couldn't see his expression clearly, but she didn't need to. She'd gotten to know the quality of his silences well enough by now to read the one he was carrying. "Go be with your daughter," he said. "I'll make sure the mess is handled for the rest of the night." "The breakfast will happen in a few hours, and you can't make it if you're on your feet with no sleep," he said. "Go. 4 hours. I'll come get you." She wanted to argue. She could feel the argument shaping itself in her chest. The one that said she was fine and there was still work to do and she didn't need to be told when to rest. She was too tired to deliver it convincingly. 4 hours, she said. "I'll make sure the stove doesn't go cold," he said. She went. She walked back through the howling dark between the bunkhouse and the main house, the snow hitting her face in needles, and she pushed through the kitchen door into the warmth and found Elsie sitting at the work table with a cup of warm water. Someone had given her warm water, which was either Silas or someone following his instruction, and her rock and her red wool arranged in front of her. Elsie looked up. "Mama, are the Cowboys okay?" "They're okay," Maeve said. She sat down across from her daughter, right there at the work table, and for a moment she just looked at her. 6 years old, gray eyes, flour on her sleeve from earlier in the night, when she'd helped with exactly one biscuit cut, and then gotten too tired to continue. Was it enough food? Elsie asked. Yes, Maeve said. It was enough. Elsie nodded, satisfied with this, and picked up her red wool and began winding it around her fingers in the repetitive way she did when she was getting sleepy again. Outside, the storm kept going. Inside, the stove was burning steady, the bread pans were cooling on the counter, and the smell of the night's work, coffee and apples and beef and bread, was still in the air, layered into the warmth of the room, like something that had decided to stay. Maeve put her arms on the table and her head on her arms and was asleep in under 2 minutes. She slept 4 hours and 12 minutes, which she knew, because when Silas knocked twice on the kitchen door frame at 6:30 in the morning. She came awake fast and looked at the clock on the shelf before she looked at anything else. It was a habit from Bitter Creek, where missing your window by even 20 minutes could mean 47 men standing around in the dark waiting for coffee that wasn't ready, which was the kind of thing that started arguments and ended jobs. Elsie was already awake, sitting in her corner spot with her wool and her rock, watching her mother with the patient attention of a child who has learned that adults waking up need a moment before they're useful. The stove didn't go cold, Silas said from the doorway. He said it like a report, like he'd made a commitment and was confirming it had been kept. I can see that, Maeve said. She stood up, and her back informed her with considerable feeling about the 4 hours she'd spent with her head on a work table. She ignored it and reached for her apron. The blizzard had not broken. It was lighter than it had been in the night. Not calm, but no longer the sustained assault that had been hitting the walls since 3 in the morning. And the world outside the kitchen window was the particular blank white of a landscape so fully covered in snow that it had temporarily stopped looking like geography and started looking like absence. No fence lines visible, no yard, just white and the dark shapes of the barn and bunkhouse emerging from it like things that hadn't fully decided to exist yet. Breakfast for 30 men in a blizzard with 4 hours sleep in her body was not the hardest thing Maeve had done in the past 12 hours, which was a fact she found both reassuring and faintly absurd. She worked fast. Bacon, cornmeal porridge in the large pot, eggs from what was left of the supply. Not enough for 30, but enough to make it feel like more than it was if she scrambled them loose and got them to the table, hot. More biscuits, more coffee, and the last of the sourdough bread sliced and set near the stove to warm through. She sent Tobias, who appeared at 7 looking like he'd slept approximately as well as she had, back and forth with the carrying work. And by 7:30 the bunkhouse mess was running again, and the sounds coming through from the other side of the serving window were the sounds of men eating with the appetite of people who'd burned everything they had the night before and were rebuilding from scratch. She heard laughter at one point, actual laughter, not the edge of mean kind that Cutter Briggs had been producing for her first 3 weeks at the ranch. The easy kind. The kind that happens in warm rooms when people have food in front of them and the worst of something is behind them. It was a small thing. She noticed it anyway. The blizzard officially broke by noon, or rather, it reduced itself from catastrophic to merely serious, which on the Wyoming frontier in late November passes for a conclusion. The wind dropped. The snow thinned from a wall to a presence. Men started moving around the yard again, slow and careful, digging out the paths between buildings and checking on the cattle that had been sheltered in the barn and the south pasture windbreak. The damage assessment had the tight-jawed efficiency of men who had been through bad winters before and knew that tallying losses fast was better than finding them out slowly. Maeve kept cooking. This was the thing nobody outside a working ranch kitchen ever fully understood. There was no day off on the other side of a crisis. The crisis ended, and the meals kept coming. The men were still here, still hungry, still needing 3 solid meals a day, and the fact that she'd been awake for most of the previous 36 hours was information that the lunch and supper preparations could not accommodate. She managed it the way she always managed it, which was by not looking at the whole of it at once, and instead just doing the next thing, and the next thing after that. By mid-afternoon, she had the kitchen in reasonable order and a pot of bean soup going for supper that needed minimal attention, and she allowed herself to sit down for 20 minutes with a cup of coffee at the kitchen table. Just 20 minutes. She'd learned at Bitter Creek that 20 minutes sitting down could buy you 2 more hours of functional operation, and 2 hours was what she needed to get through supper. Elsie climbed up onto the bench across from her and put her elbows on the table and her chin in her hands, and looked at her mother with the focused assessment of a 6-year-old conducting an inspection. "You're very tired," Elsie said. I am, Maeve said. Mr. Granger was watching you this morning, Elsie said. When you were cooking, he stood in the doorway for a long time. Did he? He looked. Elsie paused, searching her vocabulary for the right word with visible effort. He looked like when you see something you forgot you lost. Maeve wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at her daughter. The accuracy of 6-year-olds was something she had never fully adjusted to. They hadn't yet learned to sand the edges off their observations. They just said what they saw. Finish your bread, Maeve said. I already finished it. Then go find Tobias and see if he needs help with anything in the barn. Tobias said I'm not supposed to go in the barn without you. Then find something else to do. Elsie looked at her for another moment, the look of a child who knows when she's being redirected and has decided to allow it, and climbed back down from the bench and went to find her rock and her wool. The knock on the back door came at 3 in the afternoon. Not one of the ranch hands. They came through without knocking, which had stopped bothering Maeve sometime in the second week because you couldn't run a kitchen where every entry required a formality. This knock was deliberate. 2 sharp raps, evenly spaced, the knock of someone who was not sure of their welcome and was announcing themselves accordingly. She opened the door. The man standing on the back step was not anyone she recognized. I was somewhere in his mid-50s, heavy through the shoulders, wearing a good coat that was nevertheless covered in trail snow, and he had the look of a man who was accustomed to being received well and was calibrating his approach based on an audience he hadn't assessed yet. Behind him, barely visible through the snow that had picked back up since noon, was a wagon and a driver. Afternoon, he said. I'm looking for the ranch cook. Name's Barrett Hollis. I own the Double H spread, east of the ridgeline. I'm the cook, Maeve said. Barrett Hollis looked at her with brief, frank surprise, the kind that comes from expecting something different and recalibrating fast. Then he produced a smile that had been used many times and maintained well. Mrs. Rowan, I've been hearing about you since this morning when my foreman came in from the Clearwater and told me what happened here last night. 30 men, 1 cook, blizzard conditions. He shook his head with what appeared to be genuine admiration. I run a spread twice the size of Blackridge. 40 riders in the busy season, sometimes more. My current cook is leaving in spring. He paused to let that land. I double whatever Granger is paying you, plus a private room for you and your daughter, and a cabin of your own if you want it by summer. Maeve looked at him. She looked at the wagon behind him. She thought about the number he'd referenced, double, and what double would mean practically for herself and for Elsie. What it would mean to have money saved instead of money just sufficient. I appreciate the offer, she said. But? Barrett Hollis heard the shape of what was coming. But I'm not available, she said. His smile stayed but changed quality slightly. Mrs. Rowan, I don't think you understand the scope of Mr. Hollis. She kept her voice even. I understand the scope. I'm not available. Thank you for stopping. He stood on the step for a moment longer, a man who had gotten where he was by not taking the first no he received. Then he looked at her face and apparently concluded that this was not a negotiating position, but an actual position, which were different things and required different responses. He tipped his hat. If you change your mind, he said. I won't, she said. But safe travel getting home. The south road is clearer than the north. He went. She closed the door. She stood at it for a moment with her hand still on the latch, looking at the wood grain of the door, not entirely sure what she'd just done or why she'd done it with such immediate certainty. She had thought about the money. She had thought about Elsie. And she had felt, underneath all of that thinking, something that could not be argued with. A sense that leaving Blackridge Ranch would be leaving something unfinished, and that unfinished was not a state she was willing to accept. She hadn't sorted out yet exactly what that something was. She went back to her bean soup. Silas found out about Barrett Hollis's visit from Dell because on a ranch of any size, the information flow between what happened and what the boss knew about it was remarkably short. He came into the kitchen that evening before supper with the same doorway-stopping approach he always used, and he looked at Maeve with an expression that she'd learned to read as him thinking several things at once and deciding which one to say first. Barrett Hollis came by, he said. He did, Maeve said. Dell said you turned him down. I did. Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked at the soup pot. He looked at the bread she was slicing. He looked at the arrangement of the kitchen. the order she'd brought to it, and maintained under conditions that should have disrupted it completely. And then he looked at her. "Why?" he said. It was a direct question, and it deserved a direct answer, and Maeve had been working out what that answer was since 3 in the afternoon. "Because I started something here," she said, "and I don't leave things I've started." It was true. It was also incomplete, but the incomplete part was not something she had language for yet, so she left it at that. Silas looked at her for a long moment. "The pay here isn't what Hollis would offer." "I know that. I could—" He stopped. Started again. "I could look at what I'm paying." "You pay what you agreed to pay," Maeve said. "I'm not asking for more." "I know you're not asking," he said. "That's not the same as not needing it." She looked up from the bread at that. He was watching her with a directness that was different from his usual careful distance. Closer, somehow. Less glass between whatever he was thinking and what showed on his face. "We're fine," she said. "You're fine," he said, "because you haven't stopped moving since you got here. That's not the same as fine." She didn't have a quick answer for that. She knew he was right. She also knew that being right about someone's situation and being entitled to have an opinion about it were two different things, and she was still working out where the line was between those with this man. "Supper's in 40 minutes, she said. He understood the redirect. He went, but he stopped in the doorway, that habit, and said without turning, "I'm glad you stayed." Then he went before she could respond. She stood holding this bread knife and looking at the empty doorway, and felt the thing in her chest that she'd been not examining for days do something that made not examining it significantly harder. She put the knife down. She checked the soup. She kept moving. The days after the blizzard settled into a different rhythm than the weeks before it. Something had shifted in the ranch's atmosphere in the way that weather shifts things. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that the air feels different after a storm has passed, and you can't quite identify one specific thing that changed, except that something has. The men who had come off that cattle drive and eaten Maeve's food in the bunkhouse mess with their hats on the table, they looked at her differently now. Not with the exaggerated deference that makes a person uncomfortable, not with the performing of respect that men sometimes do when they feel guilty about prior behavior, just differently. With the particular naturalness of people who have updated their understanding of someone and moved on. Cutter Briggs did not apologize. She had not expected him to. But he stopped. The comments stopped. The testing stopped. He came in for meals and ate and occasionally said something to her that was in the vicinity of civil, and once, when she was carrying a heavy pot from the bunkhouse back to the main kitchen and the snow underfoot was treacherous, he appeared beside her without a word and took the pot from her hands and carried it without being asked and without making anything of it. She didn't make anything of it either. That was the right call, and she knew it. Preach, the older hand with the storm cloud beard, started bringing her wood for the kitchen bin every morning before breakfast without being asked. He just did it. Appeared at 6 a.m. with an armload of split wood and stacked it neatly and went to get his coffee and never mentioned it. After the third morning, she stopped being surprised by it and started working it into her timing. Tobias started asking her questions about cooking. Not the way that people ask questions to fill silence, but the actual interested questions of someone who wants to understand how something works. How do you know when the dough is ready? Why does the sourdough taste different from the quick bread? What does it mean when the stew smells like it's getting close to burning, and what do you do about it? She answered him plainly, the way she'd want to be answered if she were the one asking, and she noticed that he actually listened and retained it and applied it, which was more than most adults managed. "You thinking about becoming a cook?" she asked him one afternoon. He shrugged with the studied casualness of a 20-year-old who doesn't want to commit to having a dream in front of someone who might judge it. "Maybe," he said. "Seems like something worth knowing." "It is," she said. "Move that bread pan before it gets too close to the back of the oven." He moved it. Elsie was another matter entirely. She had, with the quiet determination that she brought to everything, been conducting her own separate campaign in the main house that Maeve had only partial visibility into. Maeve would surface from the kitchen and find evidence of it, a drawing left on the table in the front room that showed what appeared to be a horse and a very tall person and a small person, signed in Elsie's uneven 6-year-old capitals. Elsie and Mr. Granger and a horse says so. A question at supper one evening about whether Mr. Granger had any children of his own. asked directly at the table in front of 4 ranch hands, in a voice designed to carry, while Maeve considered briefly whether the floor might open and receive her. An observation delivered to nobody in particular in the kitchen one morning, in the tone of someone reading from a document. Mr. Granger said the ranch used to have more flowers. Maeve had looked up. "When did you talk to Mr. Granger?" "This morning," Elsie said. "He was looking at the yard and I asked him what he was looking at and he said it used to look different." "You shouldn't bother him when he's working." "He wasn't working," Elsie said. "He was just standing there looking sad." Maeve had gone back to what she was doing and thought about flowers. The thing about Silas was that he was present in the house in ways that a man running a ranch didn't have to be. He could have been in the barn, in the fields, in the outbuildings, or the supply shed, or any of the dozen other places that had legitimate claim on a rancher's time. Instead, he had a habit of appearing in the main house at odd hours, mid-morning, mid-afternoon, in the vicinity of wherever the household's life was actually happening. He'd come to check the account books in the front room while Maeve was working in the adjacent kitchen. He'd stop on the way back from the barn to get something from the pantry he didn't strictly need yet. He'd asked her twice now for her opinion on things that were not kitchen-related. Whether she thought the south bunkhouse roof needed attention before spring, whether the supply order schedule made sense, or whether she'd want different timing for fresh provisions. They were practical questions. She answered them practically. But they were also the questions of a man who was looking for reasons to be in the same room as a particular person, and Maeve had been alive long enough and married long enough and widowed long enough to recognize the shape of that without needing to name it. She didn't name it. She answered the questions about the roof and the supply schedule and went back to her work and felt the thing in her chest continue its quiet, inconvenient evolution. It was Preach who said something about it, which surprised her, because Preach was not a man who said unnecessary things. It was a Saturday, 3 weeks after the blizzard, and Preach had stayed after the rest of the hands drifted out following supper to bring in the final load of wood for the evening. He set it in the bin and then stood there, not quite moving to go, in the way that someone stands when they've decided to say something and are choosing the moment. "Rowan," he said. "Preach," she said, "for what it's worth." He looked at the wood bin, at his own hands, at some middle point that was neither. Man hasn't looked at anything the way he looks at this kitchen since before his wife got sick. He paused. "That's worth something. Just so you know, someone noticed." He went before she could answer. She stood in her kitchen, the supper dishes half done, the fire in the stove doing its slow, patient work. And she thought about that for a long time. The second offer came not from a neighboring rancher, but from the town of Millhaven itself, in the form of a letter delivered by the supply wagon on a Wednesday. It was from a man named Garrett Cross, who owned the Millhaven Hotel and its restaurant, and who had apparently heard about the blizzard night through the kind of frontier information network that travels at the speed of anyone passing through a general store. The letter was well written and the offer was specific. Head cook of the Cross Hotel restaurant, regular hours, regular pay, considerably above what she made at Blackridge, a rented room in the hotel for herself and her daughter at reduced rate, and the particular appeal, stated plainly, which she respected, of working in a town where Elsie could attend school. That last part was the one that sat with her. She read the letter twice, standing at the kitchen window with the afternoon light coming in thin and cold, and she thought about Elsie in school with the specific weight of a mother who has been carrying the knowledge that her child's education was being deferred and who has been telling herself that it was temporary. 6 years old. She should be in a classroom. She put the letter in her apron pocket and went back to supper preparation, and didn't mention it to anyone. She thought about it for 3 days. On the third day, Elsie found the letter. She didn't read it. She could read some words, but not a full letter. But she looked at the envelope and looked at her mother and said, "Is someone asking us to leave?" "No," Maeve said. "Someone's asking if we want to." "Do we want to?" "I'm thinking about it." Elsie sat with this. She sat with it the way she sat with most things, fully, without fidgeting, giving it the weight she thought it deserved. "I like it here," she said finally. "I know you do." "Mr. Granger let me name one of the horses," Elsie said. "I named her Margaret." "I know, you told me." "He said Margaret was a good name for a horse." "Elsie, I just think we should stay." She said it simply, not pleading, not performing, just stating her position the way she did. "It feels like ours. Maeve looked at her daughter. 6 years old, her gray eyes serious and settled, sitting in the corner of a kitchen in Wyoming with her rock and her red wool, calling a cattle ranch hours with the natural authority of a child who has decided something and doesn't understand why it should be complicated. "Let me talk to Mr. Granger," Maeve said. She found him at the fence near the east pasture that afternoon, checking the line for blizzard damage. She walked out there in her coat with the letter in her pocket, and the cold coming off the snow in a flat, thin way that made the air feel like it was made of something harder than air. He saw her coming and waited. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. His face as he read it did several small things that she watched with the attention she'd been giving to his face for weeks now, whether she meant to or not. He reached the bottom. He held it for a moment. "This is a better offer than what I pay you," he said. "Yes." "The school part." He looked up. "That's a real consideration. For Elsie." "I know that." He held the letter. "Is that why you're showing it to me?" She looked at him across the cold air, and the fence line, and 3 months of daily proximity, and hard work, and all the things that had accumulated between two people who were not trying to accumulate things and were doing it anyway. "I showed it to you," she said, "because before I decide anything, I wanted to know if there was a reason to stay that was better than the reasons to go." The silence was long enough that the cold started to register through her coat. Silas looked at the letter in his hand. He looked at the fence line. He looked at her. And there it was again. The expression she'd first seen in the bunkhouse mess with the hats on the tables. The one that looked like a man updating an assessment. Except this time the assessment was not of a kitchen or a cook, and the updating was going somewhere that made his jaw tighten and his eyes do something complicated. "I could pay you what Cross is offering," he said, "or close to it. And Millhaven School takes students from ranch properties. The supply wagon goes to town twice a month, but I could make it more regular if—" "Silas." She had not used his first name before. She'd been careful about that, the way she was careful about things that couldn't be uncrossed. She watched him register it, a small stillness, the way a man goes still when something he wasn't expecting reaches him. "I'm not asking you to outbid him," she said. "I'm asking you a different question." He knew what the question was. She could see that he knew. He was not a slow man, and he had not been unaware of the same accumulation she'd been aware of. She was certain of it. He had just been where she'd been, holding it at a careful distance, not naming it. He folded the letter with deliberate care and held it out to her. She took it. "Stay," he said, "not because of the wages, not because of what you do in the kitchen." He looked at her with the directness he rarely used, and she understood why he rationed it. It was the kind of directness that made everything it touched unavoidably real. "Because this ranch is better with you in it. Because my house is better with you in it. Because—" He stopped. "Because," she said, "because when I came in from the north fence last Thursday, and I could smell the bread from 50 yards out, it was the first time in 3 years that coming home felt like coming home." He said it in one even sentence, like something he'd rehearsed, and then decided to just say, "That's what I've got. If that's a reason, then it's a reason." The wind moved between them, cold and flat, and indifferent to everything they were standing in the middle of. Maeve folded the letter from Garrett Cross and put it in her coat pocket. "I'll write him back tonight," she said. Silas looked at her. "To decline," she said. Something moved across his face, quick and real and unguarded in the way that things are real when they're felt before they can be managed. He looked away first, out toward the east pasture, the snow, the wide pale sky. "Elsie named one of the horses Margaret," he said. "I heard," Maeve said. "It's a good name for a horse," he said. "That's what you told her." He almost smiled again. This time it got a little further than the last time. "I meant it," he said. She left him at the fence and walked back toward the house, the snow compressing under her boots in that particular flat sound it makes when it's been down long enough to settle, and she did not look back because she didn't need to. She already knew he watched her go. She'd known that for a while. In the kitchen, supper needed starting. The fire needed building up. There were biscuits to make and a pot to get going, and Tobias would be by in an hour, wanting to learn something about bread. And Elsie would come in from wherever she'd been and need to be fed and settled. And the ranch would roll into its evening with the reliable momentum of a thing that has been going long enough to know its own rhythms. Maeve hung up her coat. She rolled up her sleeves. She reached for her apron. From the window, the last light of the afternoon was doing something across the snow that was almost worth stopping to look at. That particular flat gold that comes right before winter dark, when everything is quiet and the world looks like it's been simplified down to its essential shapes. She didn't stop to look, but she noticed it. That was enough. Winter settled over Blackridge Ranch the way it always did in that part of Wyoming. Not all at once, but in increments, each week taking a little more of what was left of the color out of the world, until the whole landscape was reduced to white and gray, and the dark lines of fence posts disappearing into distance. December came in quiet after the violence of the November blizzard, as though the weather had spent itself and needed time to rebuild. Maeve wrote her letter to Garrett Cross the evening she came in from the east fence line. She kept it short and direct, the way she kept most things. She was grateful for the offer. She was declining. She wished him well in finding someone suited to the position. She sealed it and gave it to Dell to put on the next supply wagon to Millhaven, and she did not think about it again, because she had made the decision, and second-guessing decisions after they were made was a habit she'd worked hard to break, having seen what it did to people who couldn't. What she did think about, in the quiet spaces between the work, and there were fewer of those spaces than most people would consider healthy, which was possibly deliberate, was what she'd said to Silas at the fence, the question she'd asked, and what he'd answered. She turned it over the way you turn over something you found and aren't entirely sure what it is yet. Not with anxiety, more with the careful attention you give to things that matter and that you don't want to misread. She'd been wrong about people before. She'd trusted the permanence of things that turned out to be temporary. Her husband had been a good man, and she had loved him honestly, and she had still wound up on a freight wagon in November with $6 and a 6-year-old and a single valise, because the world does not make exceptions for good intentions or honest love when it decides to take something from you. That experience had made her careful. It had also, she was willing to admit in her more honest moments, made her perhaps more certain than she needed to be that good things were always on the verge of being taken back. Silas was not a temporary kind of man. That much she'd sorted out. He was the kind of man who had been in one place for a long time and intended to keep being there, which had its own complications. Men like that accumulated weight, history, grief that had nowhere to go. But it was not the uncertainty she was most afraid of. What she was most afraid of, if she was being precise about it, was becoming necessary to someone, and then discovering that necessary and wanted were not the same thing. She watched him, in December, with more attention than she'd previously allowed herself. He was not a demonstrative man. He didn't perform feeling the way some men did, loudly and with an audience. He showed things in small practical ways that you could ignore if you weren't looking and couldn't unsee once you were. The firewood that appeared in the kitchen bin before she asked. The way he'd redirected Cutter that first day in the yard. Not with a speech, just 2 words and a direction, and the flat look that meant it was done. The manner in which he'd stayed up through the blizzard night to make sure the stove didn't go cold, which he hadn't needed to do and hadn't mentioned afterward. The fact that he had, apparently, sat in the main kitchen at midnight talking to her 6-year-old daughter about horses and the weather and whatever else he had decided to discuss, and that he had done this without impatience and without making the child feel like a burden. She cataloged these things without meaning to, the way you catalog evidence when you're trying to be fair to both sides of something. The something, meanwhile, was becoming harder to carry at arm's length. It came to a point on a Thursday in mid-December, the kind of gray, windless day that felt like the sky had run out of ideas. Silas came into the kitchen at mid-morning, the account books in the front room approach, which she recognized now for what it was, and stood at the far end of the work table and watched her work in a way that was not casual enough to be casual. "You've been quiet," he said. "I'm usually quiet," Maeve said. She was making pastry, the kind of focused work that benefited from not being interrupted, but she didn't tell him that. "Quieter than usual," he said. She kept working the dough. "I've been thinking." "About?" She looked up at him. She'd been deciding for a week whether to say this or keep it in the careful private place where she'd been keeping it, and looking at him now, she decided that keeping it was costing more than saying it. "About the difference," she said, "between being useful to someone and being wanted by them." He was quiet for a moment. He understood what she meant. She could see that he understood. He was not a man who needed things explained twice. He looked at the work table. "I know the difference," he said. "Do you?" "Maeve." He said her name the way he said most things, without decoration, just the word itself with its full weight. I had a cook before you. 2 cooks before you. One of them was better at biscuits than you are. A beat, marginally. And I didn't think about either of them once when they weren't standing in front of me. He looked at her directly. I think about you when you're not in the room. I think about you when I'm at the fence line and when I'm doing the accounts and when I'm sitting at supper, even when you're the one who made the supper and you're sitting 12 feet away. He paused. I don't know what you want me to do with that information, but I'm not going to pretend it isn't there. The pastry dough needed another 30 seconds of working, and she gave it those 30 seconds because her hands needed something to do. I've been wrong before, she said, about permanence. So have I, he said. My wife was 29. I thought I had 40 more years. He said it without self-pity, just fact. Being wrong about permanence doesn't mean permanence isn't real. It just means you didn't get the one you thought you had. She pressed the dough flat, folded it, pressed it again. I'm not the same as I was before, she said. Before my husband. Before Bitter Creek. Before all of it. She paused, looking for the word. I'm patched together. There are parts of me that don't line up the way they used to. I know that, Silas said. I can see where the patches are. I'm not under any impression that I'm getting something undamaged. He looked down at his own hands on the edge of the table. Neither am I. She looked at him, really looked, the way she'd been carefully not looking for months, the lines around his eyes that were too deep for his age, the particular set of his shoulders that was permanent now, the posture of a man who'd been carrying something alone for long enough that he'd forgotten what it felt like to put it down. The way he stood in doorways before entering rooms, checking first, careful about the space he took up. Patched together. Yes. So was he. I'm not leaving, she said. I decided that at the fence. That's not the question. Then what's the question? She looked at him. Whether you're asking me to stay as your cook or as something else. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the gray sky sat on the world like a lid. Something else, Silas said. He said it simply, the way he said true things. Maeve let out a breath that had been held too long and turned back to her pastry and did not say anything for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was its usual even quality with something underneath it that she didn't try to conceal. Then ask me properly, she said. Not at a fence line in the cold and not over a work table. She glanced at him. Ask me like it matters. Something shifted in his face. The unarrived smile arrived. Not the half-formed, almost there version she'd been seeing for months. The real one, which changed his whole face and was, she registered with a small private jolt, the kind of smile that made a person understand immediately why someone had married this man. All right, he said. He went. She stood at her work table and felt her hands were slightly unsteady and put that down to the fact that she'd been working the dough too long and not to anything else. He asked her that Sunday. Not elaborately, not with speeches. He asked her in the front room of the main house after supper, when Elsie had fallen asleep in the chair by the fire with her red wool in her lap, and the two of them were sitting in the particular quiet that falls on a house when a child has gone to sleep in it, and the adults are left with the warmth and the fire and each other. He sat across from her and he said, Marry me. Stay here. Let this be yours. He looked at Elsie sleeping in the chair. Let it be hers. Maeve looked at the fire. She looked at Elsie. She looked at Silas Granger across the low light of that winter room, a man who was not perfect and not undamaged, and not asking her to be either of those things either, a man who had talked to her daughter about horses at midnight during a blizzard and kept her kitchen fire going through the coldest night of the year and told her he thought about her at fence lines, and she understood with the particular clarity that comes not from certainty about the future, but from honesty about the present, that this was real, and that real was what she had asked for. Yes, she said. Not as a surrender, not as a relief, though relief was in it. As a decision, made clearly, by a woman who had learned the hard way what it cost to make decisions without all the information and had done the best she could with what she had here, which was more than she'd had in a long time. Elsie woke up 20 minutes later, the way children do, suddenly and completely, already talking. Is there any cobbler left? She said. No, Maeve said. Is there bread? Yes. Elsie climbed out of the chair and went to the kitchen with the direct purposefulness of a 6-year-old who knows what she wants. From the kitchen came the sound of a stool being dragged and a bread box being opened. Silas looked at Maeve. "Should we tell her?" "Let her eat first," Maeve said. "She makes better decisions on a full stomach." His smile came back. She was getting used to it now, or trying to. It was the kind of thing you didn't entirely get used to. They told Elsie after the bread. She sat on the kitchen stool with a piece of bread in her hand and heard the information that her mother and Mr. Granger were going to get married, and looked at each of them in turn with her gray eyes, processing. "So we're staying," she said. "Yes," Maeve said. "And this is our house." "Yes." Elsie looked at Silas. "Does that mean Margaret is my horse?" Silas looked at Maeve. Maeve looked at Silas. Something passed between them that was new and warm and slightly helpless. "Margaret is your horse," Silas said. Elsie took a large bite of bread and chewed it with satisfaction. "Good," she said. That was that, as far as Elsie was concerned. The wedding was small and plain and happened in January, in the front room of the main house, with a circuit judge who came through Millhaven twice a year and who appeared to run the proceeding with the brisk efficiency of a man who had more stops to make on a cold day. Del Hatch stood up as witness. Preach was there, and Tobias, and 3 or 4 of the permanent hands who had been at Blackridge long enough to consider themselves part of whatever this occasion was. Cutter Briggs stood near the back of the room with his hat in his hands and his face in its usual arrangement, and at the moment when it was done, he was the first person to say congratulations, which he did once, briefly, in Maeve's direction, before moving toward the kitchen where she'd left a cake. It was a good cake. Not perfect. The layer had come out slightly uneven, and she'd run short on the good sugar and substituted with less of it than she'd have liked. But it was made with care, and that counted for more than evenness. She stood in her own kitchen at her own table on her wedding day and cut slices of her imperfect cake and handed them around to the men of Blackridge Ranch, who ate them and were grateful and did not comment on the unevenness. And she felt the particular complicated feeling of a woman who has come through something long and hard and is standing on the other side of it, in a place she did not know she was heading toward, and finding it more solid underfoot than she dared to expect. It was not a fairy tale. She didn't want one. Fairy tales had a way of papering over the actual texture of a life, which was not smooth and not light, and not without its accumulation of difficult things. She had a daughter to raise and a ranch to feed and a husband who was learning how to stop being alone after years of practice, and who would have bad days about it, she knew. Days when the old grief came back up through the floor like cold air through a gap. And she would be there for those days, not because she was obligated, but because she had chosen this and she intended to mean it. She had hard days of her own ahead. She was not naive about that. What she had decided, somewhere between Bitter Creek and a freight wagon and a cold yard and a kitchen that needed fixing and a blizzard that needed surviving, was that hard days in a place that was yours were a fundamentally different thing from hard days in a place that was not. That the difference between enduring and living was, more than she'd previously understood, about the question of where you were doing it and whether you were doing it alone. Spring came the way Wyoming spring always came. Late and argumentative, snow one week and mud the next, with occasional days of thin, clear sunlight that made the whole spread look like a different kind of world, was briefly available before the cold came back to clarify that it wasn't quite done yet. But it was coming. It always came. Maeve planted things in April, in the strip of ground along the south side of the main house that Silas told her had once had a garden. She was not an expert gardener. She planted what she knew from kitchens, herbs, some root vegetables, a section that she gave over to things she thought would do well in the soil there, based on nothing except instinct, which was wrong in 2 cases and right in 3, which she considered an acceptable ratio for a first attempt. Elsie helped. Or rather, Elsie participated, which was not always the same thing. She planted things in the wrong order and at the wrong depth, and then corrected herself with the unselfconscious ease of a child who does not consider mistakes to be permanent states, and ended up with a row of something that grew with more enthusiasm than anything Maeve had deliberately planted, though what it was exactly remained unclear until June. "Turnips," Silas said, looking at the row. "I didn't plant turnips," Elsie said. "Something did," he said. Elsie stared at the turnips with the betrayed expression of a person who had intended a garden with more visual drama. "I wanted flowers," she said. You could have both, Maeve said. Turnips on that side, flowers in the next bed over. Can the flowers be tall? Some of them can. Then I want tall ones. The garden expanded that spring in whatever direction Elsie declared she wanted it to go in, which was not always the most efficient horticultural approach, but produced a strip of ground along the south wall that by July was growing turnips and 3 kinds of herbs, and a somewhat chaotic but genuinely cheerful collection of tall flowers that caught the afternoon light and threw color against the house in a way that Maeve noticed Silas looking at sometimes when he came in from the fields. Not with sadness, with something quieter than that. Something in the neighborhood of gratitude. The men of Blackridge changed over that year in ways that were gradual and not announced but visible if you were paying attention. Preach brought his damaged fiddle out of the bunkhouse in March and asked Maeve if she minded if he played it in the evenings in the kitchen, and she said she didn't mind, and so on. Evenings when the work was done, there was sometimes music in the kitchen of the main house, nothing elaborate, just the old songs that a fiddle knows, and people gathered the way people gather to warmth without discussing it. Tobias learned to make bread that was almost as good as hers, which she told him directly because he deserved to hear it, and because false modesty about a skill you've helped someone develop is a waste of everyone's time. He made a face like he was going to be casual about it, and then grinned with his whole face instead, because he was 20 years old and had just been told he was good at something by someone whose opinion he'd decided to value. Cutter Briggs remained Cutter Briggs, which was its own kind of consistency. He was never warm, exactly. He never became the kind of man who expressed himself through kindness or easy words. But he became, over that year, the kind of man who defended her in conversations she wasn't present for, a thing she found out about secondhand from Tobias, who told her that when a visiting hand from a neighboring property had made a comment about Blackridge's cook that was not respectful, Cutter had informed the man in specific terms that he could adjust his mouth or he could leave the property, and the man had, after a brief assessment of Cutter's size and tone, adjusted his mouth. She didn't mention it to Cutter. It would have embarrassed him and ruined a perfectly functional arrangement, but she made sure his coffee was always right, the way he specifically liked it, which was stronger than anyone else's, and with the cup filled all the way to the rim, which she knew mattered to him for reasons she'd never asked about. Dell remained the same as he'd always been, which was steadfast and observational and quietly useful, and was now essentially family without anyone having formally agreed to it. He ate at the main house table more often than not by June, which had happened by degrees and which nobody had commented on because it was clearly the correct outcome. The story of the blizzard night traveled, the way frontier stories travel, through supply wagons and general stores and the particular efficient network of people who have little entertainment and therefore excellent memories for a good account. By spring, people in Millhaven knew the version where Maeve had fed 40 men in a hurricane single-handed. By summer, 3 ranches to the north had heard a version where she'd kept the cattle alive herself. The versions didn't concern her. What concerned her was the actual kitchen, the actual meals, the actual work. But the reputation brought something with it that she hadn't anticipated. People stopped. Travelers, survey crews, the occasional family making their way west on the long road. When they hit the Blackridge area and the weather turned or the hour got late, word had gotten around that there was a house there where they'd be welcomed in and fed something hot before they went on their way. Silas didn't plan this. Neither did she. It happened the way things happen when a household has a genuine quality to it. People can sense it from the road. Something about the light in the windows, or the smell coming from the kitchen, or just the accumulated truth of a place where people are taken care of, and they turn toward it. She fed them all. She did not do it effortlessly. There is no such thing as effortless cooking, a fact she wished more people understood, but she did it without resentment, which mattered more. She cooked extra. She kept the coffee going later than she needed to. She put bread on the table for people who hadn't asked for it, because she knew what it was to arrive somewhere hungry and uncertain, and to have someone put food in front of you before you had to ask, and what that small act of anticipation had meant. One evening in October, a year nearly to the month since the freight wagon had brought her into this yard, Maeve stood at the kitchen window and looked out at what was now genuinely hers, the ranch yard, the barn, the south garden with its finished flowers and its accidental turnips, the bunkhouse with light in its windows, and the sound of Preach's fiddle finding its way out through the wall, the fence lines and the fields beyond them, and somewhere out there in the dark, The cattle and the land that needed constant tending and never became easy and probably never would. Silas came to stand beside her. He was quiet, the comfortable kind. "I was thinking," he said after a while. "About what?" "The north pasture fence." He was looking out the window the same way she was. "Dell thinks we should run it 200 yards east next spring, take in that lower ground." She almost laughed. She didn't. "That's what you're thinking about?" "Also other things." "Such as?" He was quiet for another moment. In the years she'd known him, she'd come to understand that his silences were not empty. He was a man who chose what to put weight on and left the rest alone. "That I didn't know what this place was missing," he said, "until it stopped missing it." She looked at the window, at their reflection in it, the two of them side by side, the kitchen light warm behind them. "It's still missing things," she said, because it was. The kitchen still had a shelf that leaned and needed fixing, and she'd been asking Dell to get to it for 2 months. There were days when Silas went quiet in the old way, the glass pane distance settling back over him for hours at a time, and those days were hard to sit with even when she understood them. There were days when she woke up in the dark and missed her husband, not Silas, but Thomas, the man she'd lost, and the specific and particular life she'd thought she was going to have, with a directness that caught her off guard. None of that had gone away. It didn't work like that. "Yes," Silas said, "it is." He said it without argument because he understood, the same way she did, that acknowledging the missing parts was not ingratitude. It was honesty. And honesty was what they'd built on from the beginning in that first kitchen conversation, "Judge me after one supper," which was a kind of promise too, to see things as they were and work with what was real rather than what was convenient to believe. Elsie appeared in the kitchen at that point, fresh from bed for no discernible reason, with her hair disordered and a general air of someone who had decided that the evening should continue. "I can't sleep," she said. "Yes, you can," Maeve said. "I was thinking about Margaret." "Margaret is asleep," Silas said. "How do you know?" "Because horses sleep at night." Elsie considered this with the focused skepticism she applied to information she suspected might be too convenient. "I want to check," she said. "Tomorrow," Maeve said. "What if she's sad?" "Margaret is not sad," Silas said. "She is a horse in a warm barn with good hay, and she is, I promise you, not thinking about anything." Elsie looked at him. Then she looked at her mother. Then she appeared to accept this against her better judgment, turned around, and went back down the hall to her room, her small footsteps fading into the quiet of the house. Silas and Maeve stood in the kitchen in the aftermath of her in the particular silence that settles when a child has just left a room. It was a different silence from the ones she'd known before Elsie. Fuller, somehow. Shaped. "She's going to be something," Silas said. "She already is something," Maeve said. "I know," he said. "I meant something additional." Maeve smiled. It came naturally, the way things come when you've stopped managing them carefully, and they just happen. She turned back to the window. Out there, Blackridge Ranch kept on being what it was, imperfect and demanding and sustained entirely by the daily stubbornness of the people who had decided it was worth sustaining. The cattle needed tending, the fences needed checking, the meals needed making, morning and noon and night, no holidays, no days when the work simply agreed to wait because you were tired. She had not changed who she was in the course of any of this. She was still a woman who got things done and did not perform the getting done of them. She was still impatient with waste and direct to the point of discomfort and capable of burning a batch of biscuits if she was distracted, which had happened twice since she got here and which she had handled by acknowledging it and making another batch. She still woke up sometimes from dreams that were not about the present and took time to locate herself in the correct year. She was still a widow, in the part of herself that carried Thomas, and she was also Silas's wife, and she was Elsie's mother, and she was the cook at Blackridge, and the woman who had kept 30 men alive in a blizzard, and the person who was going to fix that leaning shelf herself if Dell didn't get to it by end of month. And all of those things were true at once, without canceling each other out. That was what she'd learned, or relearned, or finally absorbed well enough to stop needing to relearn it. That a person was not one thing. That the accumulation of hard experience did not subtract who you were but added to it, if you let it, if you kept moving, if you stayed honest with yourself about what was real. That belonging somewhere was not a gift that the world gave you when you'd earned it. It was a thing you built, with the same daily stubbornness you brought to everything else. And it looked less like an arrival than like a practice. She banked the kitchen fire for the night. Silas checked the back door latch. A habit, his version of the doorway checking, making sure the perimeter of the thing he cared about was secure. She hung up her apron. The kitchen went quiet behind them as they left it, the fire settling into its low, steady burn, the smell of the day's work still in the air, bread and coffee, and the faint sweetness of the apple preserves she'd been putting up that afternoon. The house breathed around them, the particular respiration of a place that had people in it, and was warm because of them, and would be waiting, warm and solid, when morning came back around. It always did. And every morning she was there to meet it,